welcome to Maile occasional forum. This is our third one. We're happy to have you here, and I don't want to give you too much information except to share with all of you and with our guests and audience tonight. Our guest speaker, Jim Dator, revered, great teacher, political science, my teacher, that's why I'm saying that. And he's going to talk to us tonight, about what's going to happen or possible scenarios for what could happen after Hawaii's independence is restored. Take it away, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. That's exactly what I am going to talk about. I'm going to ask us to assume that independence happens, because I think there's a very strong possibility that it will. But I'm going to give you some experiences from myself with groups similar to yours, because too many movements fail, not because they didn't achieve the aims of their struggle, but because they did. And then were prepared they failed to ask the question, what's next? So they get whatever it was that they had been striving for, but they weren't prepared for the next step to take over once they had achieved it. There are a lot of examples of that. A couple of years ago, a certain person was standing on an aircraft carrier of the Abraham Lincoln on May 1st, 2003, and in the background it had this statement, "Mission accomplished." But I don't think mission was accomplished. I think it was a little premature, and the war 5 years later still goes on. But what I want to do actually is describe experiences that come out of my own life during a period of time in the middle of the 1980s to the early 1990s, when I was president of an organization called the World Future Studies Federation. It's probably one of the best known of organizations of futurists around the world. And because of my position in the World Future Studies Federation, certainly it wasn't because of me per se, I was invited to go to many socialist countries in Eastern Europe, in China, in the Soviet Union, even to North Korea. And I was invited there by people who were very high in those socialist governments, but who wanted to talk about a different future from the one that they were currently headed towards. I spent most of my time in countries like Yugoslavia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Estonia, and China. And I was invited, as I said, by people like the presidents of the country, or people who were the head of the Marxist-Leninist Institute, who couldn't criticize the government of the day. They couldn't say anything bad about the existing government. But as members or affiliates of the World Future Studies Federation that I was president of, they invited me in to talk about what they could discuss safely, and that was the future. And so I had an absolutely fantastic sets of experiences for about a decade, and I got to see the transformation of those socialist systems closed-hand. Not everyone gets a chance to be part of a major world event, and what was characteristic about it was how fast it happened and how peacefully it happened. I think everyone of a certain age in this audience grew up at a time when trillions of dollars and millions of lives were focused on two economic systems, political economic systems, trying to destroy each other. And one of them just said, we don't like it. I don't think we're going to do it anymore. Just like that. Almost literally overnight and peacefully, without, for the most part, any blood being shed. Now let me give you one or two examples of my own experience in this area. I went to Bulgaria several times. And once in May 1989, I was at Sofia University, the major university in Bulgaria, in a huge auditorium talking about the future of democracy. That was the task, the lecture that had been assigned to me by the people that invited me there. There were people, students all over the stage, looking in the windows from the outside. And then I went back, I gave my speech and several other things, and went back to Hawaii. And a few days later, the students were out in the street. A few months later, the whole system had just collapsed, dissolved. The Communist Party, without a struggle, without a fight, had simply said, we're not going to try to rule anymore. And within a couple of months, they had elections, pre-elections, and this was just one of several examples that I had in my own life where very, very quickly people who had wanted a major change in their political system were able to achieve it. Now, I have to honestly say that not every country that I went to and not all of the people that I spoke with were as successful as people in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and Estonia and many of the places in Eastern Europe. I also spent a lot of time in China, and a lot of time in China with people that also were interested in changing the system to some extent. In fact, one of my favorite photographs has a picture of me just after I had been elected president of the World Futures Studies Federation, shaking hands with Li Peng. Li Peng is the Prime Minister of China. So that's an example of the heights. But 3 or 4 months after we left, Tiananmen Square happened. And the system changed in some ways, but held on to power in many other ways. Probably the most tragic failure of all was in North Korea, where I had been invited by the person who was really number 2 to Kim Il-sung. His name is Wang Jong-ya, the founder of something called Juche, the political philosophy of North Korea. And he ultimately, well, basically while I was there, it was in the period just before Kim Il-sung was dying, and there was concern about who the successor would be. And this group did not want Kim Jong-il to succeed, the person who actually did succeed. They were opposed to it. And unfortunately, since they lost that power struggle, Hwang fled to South Korea, and most of the supporters and people who I knew and who invited me there had been killed. I had the opportunity 2 or 3 years ago to visit Hwang in South Korea, where he's sort of in house arrest. And Hwang actually was an extremely sad, broken man who felt his life was a failure because he had led people to expect that there would be a change of systems, but there was not a change of systems. But he, I guess he wouldn't say he was cowardly, but that was the feeling that I got. He fled the country, leaving all of his other followers to be killed. So we're dealing with very serious measures here, and we do have many examples of the fact that change can happen. So one of the things that I've wanted to know is not only how is it possible for change to happen so quickly, but also what can happen if you're not prepared when the change that you want does actually happen. And so from one point of view, the socialist experience is an example of a wonderful success. But from another point of view, and this is really the way I feel about it, many Eastern Europeans do as well, it was a colossal failure. Because the transformation did happen so quickly and so peacefully, they had spent so much time focusing on making the change occur that when it did, they simply were unprepared for what subsequently happened. They were not prepared to rule.